What's going on, everybody? What's going on, everybody? What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another episode here with the HiiiScholar. Today, we got a little something different going on today. I'm going to be reading from Dr. Gloria Larsen-Billings today, reading her article on educational debt. I actually pre-recorded this audio recording of me reading this, and we were responding to the audio recording of me reading this over the next few minutes. My goal is to keep this within 30 minutes and not waste your time, but I really wanted to get into this because we've been talking about disposability of black boys. And in that conversation, disposability, you have to now go and contextualize historically how black boys have been marginalized and in many ways left behind intentionally educational wise. So we're going to dive right in. I'm reading this article. I will be posting the reading just by itself after this episode, but hopefully you all enjoy me responding to Dr. Larsen-Billings and her idea of education debt. Hello. Today I will be reading From the Achievement Gap to the Education Debt, Understanding Achievement in U.S. Schools, published in October 2006 in the Educational Researcher. This was a 2006 presidential address given by Dr. Gloria Larsen-Billings. And it reads, "The achievement gap is one of the most talked about issues in U.S. education. The term refers to the disparities in the standardized test scores between black and white, Latina and white, and recent immigrant and white students. This article argues that a focus on the gap is misplaced. Instead, we need to look at the education debt that has accumulated over time. This debt compromises historical, economical, sociopolitical, and moral components. The author draws an analogy with the concept of national debt, which she contrasts with that of a national budget deficit to argue the significance of the education debt." So this entire article is really addressing an old question that we've had in education for a while, which is all around the achievement gap. And achievement gap became very popular in the 90s and early 2000s to explain the educational indicators and academic indicators and performance on standardized testing and standardized tests. There was a gap between white students, male and female, as well as black students and other students from other demographics. So to explain this, many educational researchers relied on this idea of the achievement gap. And I appreciate Dr. Larsen-Billings coming in here and really saying that that was a easy way to explain something that was historically dense, something that needed more contextualizing, something that needed more, just needed more. And there's no reason why we should just be putting achievement at the feet of black children or Latino children or others. I actually offer in this conversation, because I come at it from the black male studies point of view, that the educational debt in America is primarily left at the feet of black boys. So black boys are owed the most from America when it comes to who they were at the founding of their earliest universities and colleges, and the founding of public education by Horace Mann, who they were at that time, and what the promises that were made thereafter, and how those promises were never fulfilled. So let's get further into this article and listen to Dr. Larsen-Billings really contextualize how this has never been an achievement gap, but really a debt to these individuals, black boys and men, that has never been paid. In her article, she doesn't talk about black boys and men, but I want to make sure I offer that what's really missing in this article, and I challenge, future iterations of this to talk more exclusively about black boys and men and not just this broad achievement gap. I have spent the better part of this year reading the presidential address of a number of former AERA presidents. Most take the wise course of giving addresses about something they know well, their own research. Of course, I was not fully persuaded by their wisdom. Instead, I attempted to learn something new, and unfortunately, the readers will have to determine whether I learned it well enough to share it with my professional colleagues. The questions that plague me about education research are not new ones. I am concerned about the meaning of our work for the larger public, for real students, teachers, administrators, parents, policymakers, and communities in real school settings. I know these are not new concerns. They have been raised by others, people like the late Kenneth B. Clark, who in the 1950s was one of the first social scientists to bring research to the public in a meaningful way. In his work with his wife, colleague Mamie, formed the basis for the landmark Brown versus Board 1954 case that reversed legal segregation in public schools and other public accommodations. However, in his classic volume, Dark Ghetto, Dilemmas of Social Power, first published in 1965, Clark took social scientists to task for their failure to fully engage and understand the plight of the poor. To my knowledge, there is at present nothing in the vast literature of social science treatises and textbooks, and nothing in the practical and field training of graduate students in social science to prepare them for the realities and complexities of this type of involvement in a real, dynamic, turbulent, and at times seemingly chaotic community. And what is more, nothing anywhere in the training of social scientists, teachers, or social workers now prepares them to understand, to cope with, or to change the normal chaos of ghetto communities. These are grave lacks which must be remedied if these disciplines are to become relevant to the stability and survival of our society. Clark's concern remains some 40 years later. However, the paradox is that education research has devoted a significant amount of its enterprise toward the investigation of poor, African American, Latino, American Indian, and Asian immigrant students who represent an increasing number of the students in major metropolitan school districts. We seem to study them but rarely provide the kind of remedies that help them to solve their problems. To be fair, education researchers must have the freedom to pursue basic research just as their colleagues in the other social sciences do. They must be able to ask questions and pursue inquiries just because. However, because education is an applied field, a field that local states manage and declare must be available to the entire public, most of the questions that education researchers ask need to address the significant questions that challenge and confound the public. Why don't children learn to read? What accounts for the high levels of school dropout among urban students? How can we explain the declining performance in mathematics and science at the same time that science and mathematics knowledge is exploding? Why do factors like race and class continue to be strong predictors of achievement when gender disparities have shrunk? One thing she's already trying to lay out here already is that society has moved forward. However, the education of certain groups has still stayed stagnant. The education of certain groups has still stayed pretty much the same. And really the achievement gap or educational debt that she's speaking of is really across racial and ethnic lines. So we're seeing the gender issue that really, occupied or took up the space that the racial and ethnic issue was supposed to. That gap is shrinking. That gap is almost coming to a point of non-existence when you just compare the boys to the girls. However, racially, and in this conversation, I want to even offer, when you intersect, go ahead and say it, black boys particularly in education have a totally different experience than any other student. And that's why I want to introduce this article, because I not only understand that black students have a difficult role, but particularly in our schools, black boys have a certain experience that is outside of the others. And in this situation, while she's describing many other ethnic groups, it's going to be the boys in those outgroups, according to what Dr. Tommy Curry would say. So these outgroup boys, particularly black boys, have a educational debt that is much greater than those of others, especially when you start factoring in conversation of those isms that brought us to this place. And the only ism that we haven't been able to address for those black boys in education, K through 12, has been them being black boys as a part of the problem. The prevalence of the achievement gap. One of the most common phrases in today's education literature is the achievement gap. The term produces more than 11 million citations on Google. Achievement gap, much like certain popular culture music stars, has become a crossover hit. It has made its way into common parlance and everyday usage. The term is invoked by people on both ends of the political spectrum, and few argue over its meaning or its import. According to the National Governors Association, the achievement gap is a matter of race and class. Across the United States, a gap in academic achievement persists between minority and disadvantaged students and their white counterparts. It further states, this is one of the most pressing education policy challenges that states currently face. The story of the achievement gap is a familiar one. The numbers speak for themselves. In the 2005 National Assessment of Educational Progress results, the gap between Black and Latino fourth graders with their white counterparts in reading scaled scores was more than 26 points. In fourth grade, mathematics, the gap was more than 20 points. In eighth grade reading, the gap was more than 23 points. And in eighth grade mathematics, the gap was more than 26 points. We can also see these gaps persist over time. Even when we compare African American and Latinos with incomes comparable to those of whites, there is still an achievement gap as measured by standardized testing. While I have focused primarily on showing this gap by means of standardized test scores, it also exists when we compare dropout rates and relative numbers of students who take advanced placement examinations, enroll in honors, advanced placement, and gifted classes, and are admitted to colleges and graduate and professional programs. Scholars have offered a variety of explanations for the existence of the gap. In the 1960s, scholars identified the cultural deficit theories to suggest that children of color were victims of pathological lifestyles that hindered their ability to benefit from schooling. So some of the earliest explanations for the reason why Black children in general, but Black boys in particular, were behind other students was because they came from a culture that was pathological, is what they said. A culture that is inherently awful and doesn't prime and cue their students or prime and cue their children for learning and literature and some of the cultural elements that will make them, under the European and Western definition, intelligent. They were saying literally that by birth, via culture, there's no point in educating Black boys and Black children, particularly because their culture doesn't allow for them to be educated, is what that just said. Touted the importance of placing students in racially integrated classrooms. Some scholars took that report to further endorse the cultural deficit theories to suggest that there was not much that could be done by schools to improve the achievement of African American children. But Coleman et al. Were subtler than that. They argued that more than material resources alone, a combination of factors were heavily correlated with the academic achievement. Their work indicated that the composition of a school, who attends it, and the student's sense of control of the environments and their futures, the teacher's verbal skills, and their students' family background all contribute to student achievement. Unfortunately, it was the last factor, family background, that became the primary point of interest for many school and social policies. Social psychologist Claude Steele argues that a stereotype threat contributes to the gap. Social linguists such as Catherine Ahl, Lisa Delpit, Michelle Foster, and Shirley Bryce Heath, and education researchers such as Jacqueline Jordan Irvine and Carol Lee have focused on the cultural mismatch that contributes to the gap. Multicultural education researchers such as James Banks, Geneva Gay, and Carl Grant, and curriculum theorists such as Michael Apple, Catherine Kornbleth, and Dexter Wall, and Thomas Popkowitz have focused on the nature of the curriculum and school as sources of the gap. And teacher educators such as Kristen Sleeter, Matthew Cochran Smith, Kenneth Zickner, and I have focused on the pedagogical practices of teachers as contributing to either the exacerbation of the narrowing gap or the narrowing of the gap. But I want to use this opportunity to call into question the wisdom of focusing on the achievement gap as a way of explaining and understanding the persistent inequality that exists and has always existed in our nation's schools. I want to argue that this all-out focus on the achievement gap moves us towards short-term solutions that are unlikely to address the long-term underlying problem. Down the rabbit hole. Let me begin in the next section of this discussion with a strange transition from a familiar piece of children's literature. Alice started to her feet, for it flashed across her mind that she had never before seen a rabbit with either a waistcoat pocket or a watch to take out of it, and burning with curiosity, she ran across the field after it, and unfortunately was just in time to see it pop down a large rabbit hole under the hedge. In another moment, down went Alice after it, never once considering how in the world she was going to get out again. And that's from Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. The relevance of this passage is that I, like Alice, saw a rabbit with a watch in a waistcoat pocket when I came across a book by economist Robert Margot entitled Race and Schooling in the American South, 1880 to 1950. And like Alice, I chased a rabbit called economics down a rabbit hole where the world looked very different to me. Fortunately, I traveled with my trusty copy of Lakoff and Johnson's Metaphors We Live By as a way to make sense of my sojourn there. So before making my way back to the challenge of school inequality, I must beg your indulgence as I give you a brief tour of my time down there. National debt versus national deficit. Most people hear or read news of the economy every day and rarely give it a second thought. We hear we hear that the Federal Reserve Bank is raising interest rates, that the unemployment numbers look good, or ears may perk up when we hear the latest gasoline prices, or when we can get the good rate on a mortgage refinance loan. But busy professionals rarely have time to delve deeply into all things economic. Two economic terms, national deficit and national debt, seem to befuddle us. A deficit is the amount which a government's, company's, or individual spending exceeds income over a particular period of time. Thus, for each budget cycle, the government must determine whether it has a balanced budget, a budget surplus, or a deficit. The debt, however, is the sum of all previously incurred annual federal deficits. Since the deficits are financed by government borrowing, national debt is equal to all the government debt. Okay, what she's doing right now is she's actually recontextualizing what we used to think was an achievement gap, these kind of score points on standardized tests that were different between white students and other students, to really what she's trying to prove now, which is like, no, this has been accumulating debt over the course of all of these years that black boys, students have been in classrooms who have been non-white and not getting the same educational resourcing, same educational activities and information. That marginalization has now, similar to what it would do financially in economics, created this, it's a constant deficit year after year that accrues this debt, is what she's laying out here. Most fiscal conservatives warn against deficit budgets and urge the government to decrease spending to balance the budget. Fiscal liberals do not necessarily embrace deficits, but would rather see the budget balanced by increasing tax revenues from those most able to pay. The debt is a sum that has been accumulating since 1791, when the United States Treasury recorded it as $75,463,476.52. Thomas Jefferson said, "I place economy among the first and most important virtues, and public debt as the greatest of the dangers to be feared. To preserve our independence, we must not let our rulers load us with perpetual debt." But the debt has not merely been going up. Between 1823 and 1835, the debt steadily decreased from a high of almost $91 million to a low of almost $33,733.05. The nation's debt hit the $1 billion mark in 1863 and the $1 trillion mark in 1981. Today, the national debt sits at more than $8 trillion. This level of debt means the United States pays about $132,844,701,219.88 in interest each year. This makes our debt interest the third largest expenditure in the federal budget after defense, combined entitlement programs such as Social Security and Medicare. Even in those years when the United States has a balanced budget, there's no deficits. The national debt continued to grow. It may have grown at a slower rate, but it did continue to grow. President Clinton bragged about presenting a balanced budget one without deficits and not growing the debt. However, the debt was already at a frighteningly high level, and his budget policies failed to make a dent in the debt. The debt and education disparities. By now, readers might assume that I have made myself firmly at home at the Mad Hatter's Tea Party. What does a discussion about national deficits and national debt have to do with education research, and continued education disparities? It is here where I begin to see some metaphorical concurrences between our national fiscal situation and our education situation. I am arguing that our focus on the achievement gap is akin to focus on the budget deficit, but is actually happening. What is actually happening to African American and Latino students is really more like national debt. We do not have an achievement gap; we have an education debt. Now, to be perfectly candid, I must admit when I am consulted with a strict economist, Professor Emeritus Robert Haveman, of the University of Wisconsin's Department of Economics, Lafayette Institute of Public Affairs, and Institute for Research on Poverty. He stated, "The education debt is the foregone schooling resource that we have or should have been investing primarily low income kids, which deficit leads to a variety of social problems. Example, crime, low productivity, low wages, low labor force participation that require ongoing public investment. This required investment sucks away resources that could go to reducing the achievement gap. Without the education debt, we could narrow the achievement debt. The message would be that you need to reduce one, the education debt defined above, in order to close the other, the achievement gap. A parallel is trying to gain a growing and robust economy with a large national debt overhang." See what he's also doing, what she's also doing, Dr. Larsen-Billings is doing, and in this conversation with the economists, is he's connecting the actual U.S. economy to the education debt, and then for my purposes, for Black boys in K through 12 education. So this accruing of this debt over the time since enslavement and the foundation of U.S. colleges and universities, and then the public K through 12 system, the accumulation of all that debt has actually now led us to the place we are now, where it has real financial implications for the country. So we're actually not only adding to our fiscal deficits or fiscal, our annual country's debt by not paying the bill for Black boys and Black men in the education system. So if you really are trying to have a balanced budget, you have to do something about this education problem, and it's going to take resourcing it to fix this problem. Wow. In addition to this informal discussion with Haveman, I read a work by Wolf and Haveman entitled "Accounting for the Social and Non-Market Benefits of Education," which catalogs a series of what they term non-market effects of schooling. The authors contend that the literature on the intergenerational effects of education is generally neglected in assessing the full impact of education. Among them, non-market effects they include are the following: a positive link between one's schooling and the schooling received by one's children, a positive association between the schooling and health status of one's family members, a positive relationship between one's own education and one's own health status, a positive relationship between one's own education and the efficiency of choices made, such as consumer choices, which efficiency has positive effects on well-being similar to those of money income, a relationship between one's own schooling and fertility choices, in particular decisions of one's female teenage children regarding non-marital childbearing. One thing you should see in this list that she's laying out right here, Dr. Larsen-Billings, is this is really the contextualizing of the education debt. That generations have been sullied and spoiled out and snuffed out because you didn't educate the first generation of them. So think about how many Black families, because we didn't educate the Black boys and Black men in the United States. I'm not talking about our community alone, but also in our community, we did not educate the Black boys and Black men with the intent of uplifting our community. And as a result, we still left with the education debt. So while, yes, our Black girls have closed some of those gaps, But they've been closing these gaps because of the benefits of gender, and there hasn't been a real focus and attention for black boys with the idea that we're trying to uplift the community. And now you're seeing the residual effects or generational effects, the cyclical cycle of effects of not paying the educational debt, of not giving them the full education. And even the economists are saying, because you never pay the bill doesn't go away. The bill increases. The bill accrues more interest in the case of this educational debt. So just think about how much we could have interceded in our communities had we been willing to pay the debt and do it right the first time. Whether it be whenever we have these court cases at the university level and college level to allow integration, or even at the K through 12 level, if we ever fully try to give opportunities to those black boys that will actually address the debt of the times we didn't give it to them, either in Jim Crow or even in the modern war against drugs. So these are all time periods that we were ready to incriminate, but we weren't ready to pay the bills and extra resource those black boys. In other words, in a way we can intercede into our communities, and that's what really happened. A relationship between the schooling and or social capital of one's neighborhood and decisions by young people regarding their level of schooling, non-marital childbearing, and participation in criminal activities. While these economists have informed my thinking, I have taken somewhat of a different tack on this notion of the education debt. The yearly fluctuations in the achievement gap give us a short-range picture of how students perform on a particular set of achievement measures. Looking at the gap from year to year is a misleading exercise. Lee, 2002, looks at the trend line shows us that there was a narrowing of the gap in the 1980s, both between black and white students and between Latino and white students, and a subsequent expansion in those gaps in the 1990s. The expansion of the disparities occurred even though the income differences narrowed during the 1990s. We do not have good answers to why the gap narrows or widens. Some research suggests that even the combination of socioeconomic and family conditions, youth culture and student behaviors, and schooling conditions and practices do not fully explain changes in the achievement gap. However, when we begin looking at the construction and compilation of what we have termed the education debt, we can better understand why an achievement gap is a logical outcome. I'm arguing that the historical, economical, socio-political, and moral decisions and policies that characterize our society have created an education debt. So at this point, I wanted to briefly describe each of those aspects of the debt. All right, this is a good part to pause on for a second. This will be the end of part one. She's really setting this up, but she does a great job of setting up and reframing our minds to go away from just looking at year-to-year test scores and graduation rates and dropout rates. That's one way to measure education, but that doesn't necessarily give us more ideas or more effective ideas in trying to address some of these issues. What she's really trying to lay out here is, to me, she can of course say it herself, it's really what we've been missing since the Great Society, which is this comprehensive plan to uplift or to further society, to progress society. Black boys have never gotten a focused program for them to start a new generation of black boys that will continue to be educated black men. And that will start, as you saw with that list of factors, change the choices that they make throughout the arcs of their lives. So education is initially just seen as this training ground for corporations. But one thing that list did, in this part one, was detail all the other things and choices that you're going to make in your life that are related to your education. So a lot of the choices that black boys have been making over the last 100 years, 200 years, just for example, has been affected by the educational debt that is owed to them. Black boys are owed an educational debt in America where people are coming into this country and able to attain the education that black boys have been many ways marginalized from. And at this point, they have the hardest time to recover. It is a debt that has never been attended to outside of the individual or group level motivation that we've had to try to address it. How have we really sat here for so many years knowing that the United States of America has never tried to attend to the ways that kept black boys out of education, kept black men out of being educated or even literate during slavery? But now all of a sudden we think that black boys are trash, black men are trash, and part of that being because they are uneducated. They can't read, they don't want to read, they don't want to be educated. No, 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 no. They haven't been given what they need to be educated. They haven't been given what they need to maintain themselves. And you owe them a debt. I'm going to end it here. I'm HiiiScholar. I'm amazed but never surprised. If you like what I do, please hit a like. Please subscribe. If you want to donate, it's at Dr. QB. That's DOCTORQB. Y'all take it easy today. I'm going to do part 2 later on this week. We owe black boys an educational debt. Peace.